Are we rolling, Director?
We're going.
I'm on. Hi, everybody. Welcome to San Francisco Maritime National Historical Park. My name is Gina Barty. I'm the reference librarian here at the park. This is our third lecture installment of our Moby-Dick 2022 lecture series. Did we name this lecture series? I don't think we did. Just Moby-Dick 2022. That's it. Welcome. So today I'm excited to introduce our speaker. He is the author of this book, Ahab's Rolling Seas, which I have been reading, as you can see, because I have my little dog bookmark in there. It's adorable. And I have to say, this book is great. It's so interesting. I've already had like 30 aha moments of like tying Moby-Dick to climate change, things that I've never thought about before, the history of whaling, the history of taking things from the sea. It's already making connections. If you're a fan of Moby-Dick, which I think everyone is, yay, then I think this is a great companion book to help you read it in a more modern take on it. You know, books from the past are still teaching us about things in the future that they couldn't even be aware of that they'd be teaching us. Or maybe they were aware of. Maybe that's for you to talk about today. So our speaker, Richard J. King, and I'm going to be reading from the back here, as a visiting associate professor of maritime literature and history at the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. For more than 20 years, he has been sailing and teaching aboard tall ships in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Jealous. He writes and illustrates a column on marine animals for Sea History magazine, which we have many issues of Sea History magazine at the Research Center, so you can come and look at those all there. He was the founding series editor of Seafaring America, and he is the author of Lobster and a different book, The Devil's Cormorant, A Natural History. Oh, I'm going to have to read that one too. Oh man, that's great. Without further ado.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks. Yeah. Ooh, the crowds. Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Colin. It's just great to be here. I'm excited to have a small group. Welcome. Thanks for being here. And so, since we're small, should we just all go around and introduce ourselves and just kind of say sort of what brought us here? Like, are we interested? Like, do I teach Moby-Dick? I've never read it, I just came in here by accident. I thought there were free pickles, just kind of go around and just introduce yourself and then, So I've already been introduced, so Colin, do you want to start? And then let's kind of go around this way. Sure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here. And Colin and I were just talking about, nice thing group like this. If you need to get up and go, it's fine. If you're like, hey, this wasn't what I signed up for and you need to do something else, that's totally fine. So this is the plan. You should all have a piece of paper. And so basically what we're going to do is, sorry, Gina. We're basically just kind of start with the bigger picture idea of in this time of environmental crisis, why would we even spend time at all with the work of literature or work of art? And so I'm going to ask everybody to kind of brainstorm ideas, then we're going to talk them out a little bit and sort of brainstorm a list up on our vast whiteboard up there. And then I wanted to I'm going to read a short selection of about 10 minutes, kind of putting Moby-Dick into reference in terms of 21st century and climate change. And then I want to spend the time with a couple particular sections from Moby-Dick. There will be a full-on spoiler alert. So if you don't know what happens at the end, we're talking about it. So I'll tell you beforehand, but we're going to kind of go with what is the message that we take away from the main plot of the book. So first, what I'd like everybody to do, and we have some pieces of paper around and pencils that I'll pass around, but basically just to spend 5 minutes just with this very basic question, first with yourself. What is the role of past masterpieces, writing and art, as we grapple with present-day environmental concerns? So, you'd have to have your head in the sand not to be worried a little bit about what's happening with the environment right now, and then why would we spend time with classics, with masterpieces, with fiction, with art, thinking about environmental concerns? So just spend a little time brainstorming yourself with that, and then we'll ask you to talk with the people at your table. Does anybody need a piece of paper or everybody's good? Okay. And we also have blank paper if anybody wants. If you want a blank piece, here's a blank piece. If you guys want some blank piece of paper, if you don't want to write on, oh, you got it. Okay. Okay, as you finish up your thought, if you would just turn to one person next to you and just share the sort of idea that you think is the best. Like that why we, or the one that you find most intriguing. You're right, we shouldn't place value on it. I don't know, is it Shauna? Yeah, if you want to join their group, or just like why spend time with a work of art, with a work of literature when there's a climate crisis? All right, we'll kind of recollect. We'll recollect. And so what I'd like to do now is just kind of assemble some of our ideas. I know that the marker's a little bit light, but over on this section here underneath the frame picture of the wave is just kind of general ideas, and then this is our Moby, and so as you're talking, some of it might be very specific just to Moby-Dick, and others might be in general why we turn to art and literature overall. And so do we just want to start with this table and let us know some of the ideas that you came up with?
I think one of the terms was longevity. If any topics, we can find it in historical literature, you can see that that specific topic, in this case environmental concerns, played a role back then, but still plays a role now. So there's got to be something important about it.
Right, and maybe this is what you're thinking, but I feel like I, particularly as I get older and I see younger people like feeling stressed about, maybe they're feeling what we might call eco-guilt, or they're feeling stressed about the environment. Like, did people feel like that 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Was that a little bit of kind of what you were? Yeah, so what we, particularly when we're talking about the environment of eco-guilt. And that's one thing that we actually find with Moby-Dick, is that actually there was a lot of eco-guilt, even in the mid-19th century. Thoreau and many others were really concerned about endangered species, but not in the deep ocean environment, which is what's so intriguing. Other thoughts from this table?
I think that was a good summary of our conversation, because it was about how the previous generations have thought about and confronted their own environmental challenges.
Great. Sorry, this is going to just be horrible handwriting, and we're going to run out of space completely. So I'll just put kind of past perceptions. Anything else that your table want to add? What do you guys have?
Julian talked about just literature and art as being real allies with the feeling, and so if you're trying to do a action, you need to be much more powerful impulse than facts, and starting with
And we consider emotions being more powerful than fact as a teaching tool, as well as also a way to inspire change, right? Like, it's the polar bears, it's the whales that's kind of pushing us towards environmental or conservation action. It's not the Keeling curve, Keeling curve is the graph that kind of shows carbon over the last 60 years. Is that where we're? Excellent. Other things from this table?
Following someone without, fighting back because you're like going to your inevitable deaths, and like the deaths of all those whales and all that is identical to climate change. Following a path, laid out by a few insane men.
Right. So this says lessons about leadership, and that concept of that it doesn't matter necessarily what the issue is that we've got people in power that are pushing this, and group of people that are blindly following or that don't have a power to make change that are continually having to move through this idea. And it doesn't matter, could be climate change, it could be fascism, it could be, anti-Semitism, it can be anything that is moving over time where you have leaders that are commanding and Starbucks can't pull the trigger. Jillian.
I was going to add, I think that using masterpieces and artwork to discuss environmental concerns kind of broadens the audience of people who are interested in it. If you're tackling environmental issues from an interdisciplinary lens, then you're connecting with like the people who just like to read Moby-Dick, or the people who just like to look at cool paintings that have like ocean in them. And not just like people who specifically study like environmental issues.
Right, so I tried to summarize, broadens audience, more inclusive of interest. So I can, if I'm not interested in the Keeling curve, but I am interested in art, or I'm interested in whales, it is a way that we can kind of steer people in, and it's also sometimes a kind of a safer topic, like, hey, let's all talk about this work of art, work of literature that's aside from us, but isn't necessarily talking about what I personally have done wrong, or what they have done wrong, or what we collectively have. It's just this thing from 100 years ago, or 25 years ago, or it's a work of an artist, and we can kind of talk about it in a safer realm. What do you guys have? Or did you get one of these? Oh no, it's just...
I'll start. I was thinking about, it wasn't a great work of art, but I was thinking about those warning stones that are in rivers in Europe right now that are being uncovered because the drafts are so bad. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but there's like stones that are being uncovered that are like, if you see this stone, basically panic. It's not phrased that way, but if you see the stone, death and destruction are coming because the drought has gone to such a level. So they haven't seen those stones since like the 1300s. They didn't know they existed now. So I was just thinking about these kind of like Cassandra type warnings from the past, and I was just trying to wonder if modern art, do we take modern art on these topics more seriously than painting from 100 years ago or writing from 100 years ago that might have been saying the same thing? Like we tend to think that people in the past weren't like us, even though they were exactly.
Right.
There's a Roman waking up, not wanting to go to work that day.
Yeah. So it connects to these kind of universal feelings, but also in some of these works of art can really tell us environmental histories of like, what was the river level like 100 years ago? We can look at a masterpiece painting of San Francisco Bay and identify a lot of really interesting aspects of like, okay, what kind of shifts were here? How high was the sea level at that point? What was the erosion along the coast? And so some of these works of art actually have these wonderful little details that help us construct what our environment looked like in the past, or that where there are these little warnings to kind of indicate how change has happened. That's great. Thanks, Gina. Anything else you all want to add?
Was I haven't got maybe it's because we talked about it, we were talking about it, saying that the writings and masterpieces of the past will inspire us and make us realise everything's connected. And the environment is hard, health of everything is hard, but eventually you harm yourself. And it's evident in looking at the history and the works of the past as well. It's very hard to find it, but you really see it.
It totally does, and it's almost like you have read Moby-Dick, because that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. And like, we'll just go right to one of the spoiler alerts of like, Ahab, like Moby the whale never kills Ahab, right? Ahab kills himself in the process of trying to kill the whale, and which is not a small point. Like he, and Starbuck is like, Ahab, like you're pursuing him, he's not pursuing you. And Ahab, in the act of trying to kill Moby, kills himself, and then eventually the ship itself. So that point that you're making about we're really harming humanity and ourselves in this broader destruction, is very much a message of a work like Moby-Dick and so many other works. Okay, no problem. I mean, that's pretty much it, yeah. Anne, did you want to add anything?
Well, I thought about my first thought was helping to illustrate the past that may no longer be present, that those markers of, well, does telegraph hill look like that anymore, or what did it look like prior to all of the ships coming to San Francisco, those kinds of markers. But while thinking about that, thought about the erasure and idealization that happened while the artists were making, like the Hudson Valley School.
Yeah, Hudson River Valley, yeah. Uh-huh.
But their portrayals of Niagara Falls were idealized and pristine wildernesses when that area was already starting to see commercialization, starting to see vendors and tourism. And the same thing, similarly in other national parks, these kinds of depictions that didn't indicate what was, but what they wanted to be.
Right, I love that. So much of, when we create a work of art or we write a story or we tell, something that happened to a friend of ours this afternoon, we're shaping that based on kind of what we want to see, what we want to include, what we don't want to include. And when we're trying to understand, what was the perception of the ocean 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and we go to these works of art, part of it is what they write about and how they portray it, but also what they don't write about and what actually we know from historically was there. And so I think that's a really good point of really thinking about what actually is not in this space, that if we are trying to create an accurate depiction. These are great. So all concepts that we were putting in this sort of broader thing that scholars refer to as eco-criticism, of how do we go to a work of literature or art and get lessons from the environment about it? A couple things that I might add to this list is just, I guess, a little bit on this sort of inclusivity idea, that idea that we just love, we are storytelling people. Humans tell stories, we need stories, and so we need these kind of characters and individuals and stories and images to be able to communicate and to talk about. It's no accident that every major faith has a major work of written work, that it refers to these stories that it's continually retelling. And Moby-Dick, for better or worse, is one of our international cultural stories. There aren't that many characters where you can draw a picture of a guy with a peg leg and everyone's like, oh yeah, Ahab, and 90% of the people haven't read the story, but they kind of generally know it, just like we draw a kid with, the lightning bolt on his forehead and we're like, okay, Harry Potter, so there actually aren't that many stories that are so universally known in popular culture. And so we can continually refer to Moby just like we can refer to Jonah or some of the major Old Testament stories. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about Moby as we go. But this is a recent book for those of you that are teaching Moby-Dick that just came out. It's called A New Companion to Herman Melville by Wiley. And there's a whole bunch of chapters in it that are really meant for high school students and college students. Some are by museum curators, some are by scholars. And I did the ocean chapter. And so I want to just read one thing about blue eco-criticism and then give you about a 10-minute reading just talking about climate change in the novel in particular. Eco-criticism sort of began in the 1970s, and it corresponded with modern environmental movements led by writer-activists such as Rachel Carson, Farley Mowat, and Barry Lopez. Literary critics sought to study the human impact on the environment, proposing an angle of reading and interpretation that has since been called eco-criticism. And scholars of Glenn Love began asking what the works they regularly used in classes about modern human relationships with the natural world, or what new works would raise awareness of the need for conservation. Some of eco-criticism's primary questions include, and we'll see if these kind of match up to some of the things we discussed. What can this work reveal about the author's perspective on the natural world? Check. What cultural, economic, social, or technological aspects of the author's or reader's world might influence the writing or reading of this text? So that technology, come on in. Technology was something we didn't talk about too much. How about, oh yeah, you can sit wherever you like, and this is what we're doing. We haven't talked about technology as much, but sort of referred to it a little bit with how we read the text. How, when, and why are humans elevated or decentered in a given text? How does the text advocate for or undermine human connections with the non-human world? Gender, race, language, class, location, job, and political party all influence how one interacts with nature, defines nature, thinks about nature, or reads about and writes about nature. For example, and this begins to our first point, did anyone in the 1800s feel as helpless and guilty about our human impact on the natural world as so many people do today? Literary works as cultural artifacts can address such questions as this. And so thinking about these masterpieces as cultural artifacts, things that are left, they are, what do you call warning stones? Is that what they're called? Yeah. Let's call them warning stones or time capsules that are left to reveal a perception of a given location. And it turns out that Moby-Dick is just like an extraordinarily ideal and rare benchmark of the perception of the ocean in the mid-1800s, both because Melville was not only a sailor and had been there himself and spent multiple years at sea, but he was also a scholar and a reader. And so he puts together in this work of fiction this extraordinary benchmark that gives all of these details about how people perceive the natural world in the 1850s, all these different perspectives, as well as a lot of really factual understanding of marine biology, oceanography, as represented by the knowledge in the 1850s, which is only a decade before Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And so we're really in this extraordinarily interesting spot right at the start of the Industrial Revolution that's really kicking in. We're at the height of the whaling industry. We're On the Origin of Species. And Melville's giving this enormous cultural artifact with all these different perspectives and viewpoints of how we saw the natural world, in particularly the ocean environment, in the 1850s. So I wanted to share, and this will be the kind of like reading portion just for about 10 minutes. And this is basically reading Melville in the Anthropocene. And sort of this concept of, how do we read, what are some things that we can think about? And you're welcome to doodle during this, draw pictures, go to the bathroom. But let's start with the IPCC report. In September of 2019, a month after the bicentennial of Melville's birth, the IPCC published The Ocean and the Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. The report synthesized for policymakers all of the current scientific work on climate change and projected effects on the ocean and ice and the subsequent impact on humans and the rest of Earth's inhabitants. How many people in here have read that report? Nice. Okay, a little bit. It is supremely long and boring. Even the executive summary is not an easy read. The IPCC report begins with an executive summary that simply states, quote, all people on Earth depend directly or indirectly on the ocean and the cryosphere, and that's what we're talking about, the ice environments. The global ocean covers 71% of the Earth's surface and contains about 97% of the Earth's water. The IPCC report refers to very few papers, however, that can reliably speak to conditions at sea in Melville's time. Since the Industrial Revolution, and we can kind of put that more towards the early 18th century, like a fun little fact is James Cook's Endeavour was actually a collier. It was actually, that ship was originally hauling coal all around Britain. Humans have been combusting an increasing amount of fossil fuel that has emitted unnatural volumes of carbon into the atmosphere. Add this to the increasing deforestation, industrial farming, and the emissions of other greenhouse gases, and we have our anthropogenic climate crisis. This report by the IPCC makes a series of alarming statements about global ocean temperatures and how they have risen rapidly. The rate of ocean warming has likely doubled since 1993. The warming ocean has also become more acidic, a change which is harmful, in places catastrophic, for marine life in coral reefs, rocky intertidal zones, and other coastal ocean ecosystems. This acidification, heating, and subsequent shifting in currents and upwelling have in turn likely sucked a substantial ratio of the oxygen out of the upper 1,000 feet of the ocean, where most marine animals and plants live. Meanwhile, storm systems thumping and blasting our coastlines have become more intense on average and perhaps are billed with greater frequency. We know that we're in the midst of 2 hurricanes on the East Coast right now. Records show that even the extreme wave heights in the North Atlantic and the Southern Ocean are increasing. The IPC authors write that, quote, "From the equator to the poles and from the surface to the deep sea floor, marine animals and plants have been dying and will continue either to die or adjust their distribution, migrations, abundance, and ecology to this quick shift in climate. Some species will benefit, perhaps whales, but far more will become endangered or even locally or globally extinct before their time." The IPCC report states with, quote, "high confidence that the rate and magnitude of decline are projected to be highest in the tropics." In short, for non-human life, the ocean is changing fast and faster and for the worse. For humans, ocean climate change has broad effects on human food security, renewable energies, how we travel, how we make money, where we live, what we value, and even how and where we like to enjoy ourselves. Our 21st century relationship with the ocean in the Anthropocene leads then to new readings of Herman Melville. In Moby-Dick, Ahab stands aloft and declares his ocean, the same to Noah as to me. We know now, though, that the ocean is very much not the same. It wasn't the same in, imagine, Noah's time as it was in the mid-19th century, and it's absolutely not the same today as it was in Melville's time. Yet how could Melville have possibly conceived that humans would alter our global ocean, shift the very height of the sea's surface, the very chemistry of the water, and even render heaven's storms more intense? So in the 1850s, Melville could never have imagined 21st century goals of, quote, saving the oceans or the desire to steward the sea. Those ideas would have been, if not comical, heretical to Melville, that humans could actually be adjusting the average height of the ocean. Melville never touched or saw anything that had any unknown biodegradability, something that's both obvious and also really profound. He never held a piece of plastic. That said, perhaps we have still underestimated how Melville and others of his time felt guilty about human impact on the natural world, even if their individual helplessness to counter this destruction might have been tempered or rationalized by American manifest destiny and a perception of God's role in the natural order. Perhaps Ishmael hopes that he can escape to sea to get away from these visions, away from his eco-guilt, and back to the pre-Adamite wild, because he still genuinely believes in a pure, deep, dangerous ocean that remains beyond the touch of man. And I think that gets to that kind of Hudson River School and this idea of, how do we think about the ocean? We're still clearly drawn to this space. We still see this as this purifying space, wild space, healing space, and yet it's changed and been altered so much by human activity. Another thing that these sort of classics can do is they grapple with some of these very basic questions that involve any crisis, about faith and destiny and God's role depending on our beliefs. And so some of us with the current climate change might be like, this is God's role, and this is what's going to happen, and I'm just going to do my best, but this is part of a larger destiny. And other people approaching this problem in a very different way, thinking about how individual fate and collective destiny might be situated, and that is something so very much that Ahab and the other characters are working with in Moby-Dick. Our current climate crisis also leads to new readings of the castaways in Moby-Dick. For the final scenes, against we're getting into our spoiler alerts here. Melville leaves open the longitude of where Ahab and the Pequod meet the white whale on the equator. But it is reasonable to imagine it somewhere among the vast and isolated nation of Kiribati, close to the implied fictional setting of Much of Mardi and the common cruising ground for 19th century whalers. If you don't know where Kiribati is, imagine the open ocean Pacific, quadruple it in your mind as to how big and spacious it is, and then this is a large swath of over 30 very small low-lying islands that covers the amount of space in the ocean about the width of the United States. Right in the middle of the Pacific, both sides of the equator, both sides of the international date line, a swath of ocean the width of the United States, about 30 islands, population of about 150,000 people, average height of these islands about 3 feet. Kiribati is today one of the island nations in the Pacific that is most vulnerable to sea level rise. The country's approximately 100,000 citizens are on the front lines of climate change, a complex existential global problem caused by nations and cultures half the globe away. The Kiribati, the people from Kiribati, have begun planning for a retreat from their islands because of the rapid loss of arable, livable space and the pollution of their groundwater. So for these islands, it's not just about sea level rise, but when sea level rise comes in, it affects their freshwater lenses, which are in these coral atolls. So it's not just about the sea coming on the beach, but it's saltwater intrusion into their freshwater sources. For the first time in recorded history, a people, an entire culture, will become a stateless republic of climate refugees. As fine artists like Timothy Vermeulen, and so that's this card here. I printed out a little bit dark here, so I apologize for that. But you're welcome to take a couple of these home, and I'll talk about how you might use them if you're interested later. As fine artists like Timothy Vermeulen have found inspiration in the novel to grapple with the impacts of coastal storms, a blue eco-critical reading of Moby-Dick considers the plight of the climate refugee, those millions of people who need to leave their homes because of sea level rise and coastal flooding. A 2019 study found that some 190 million people around the world currently live in homes that, even with a low emissions projection, will be below high tide in 2100. And that is not just in Kiribati. You know, as many of you know, this is happening along the shores of the United States, throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, Western Florida. The IPCC report explains that 10% of the world's population currently lives in high-risk, low-lying coastal zones. For example, entire communities along the coast of Louisiana have already moved, retreated, and scattered. At the end of Moby-Dick, Ishmael, the biblical orphan, floats alone, evocative of a refugee, a victim and witness to events he has no power to stop. Fittingly, the frigate bird is the national bird of Kiribati. It's the same, the frigate bird is that, those of you that know Moby-Dick, at the end there's a skyhawk or a seahawk, that's a frigate bird. And we know that because from kind of whalemen's documents in the 19th century. And that's the current bird of Kiribati that Tashtigo takes down with him as the sinking of the Pequod, and the same seabird along with the sharks that permits Ishmael safe passage as he clings to the Pacific Islander's coffin after the sinking of the ship of state. So again, no one's suggesting that Melville foresaw that in his writing. You know, some people refer to that sort of as presentism, of like, well, you can't just like read the book and say Melville was thinking about climate refugees at the time, but we're constantly rereading and reinterpreting texts, whether that's the Constitution, whether that's the Bible, whether that's any work, we read it with our own eyes in the 21st century and how it might be relevant to us and how it speaks to us. So now, whenever I read Moby-Dick, I think about that space, this floating individual, the castaway, in the waters of Kiribati. Along these lines, in an earlier scene is Pip, floating alone, a castaway and an African American who can also be read as an icon of any human whose experience teaches that social justice and environmental justice are inseparable. As the least powerful on the ship, a castaway, PIP represents those most vulnerable to anthropogenic climate change, depleted water resources, and the coastal pollution that is left in the wake of the hubris, the harpoons of petrocapitalism. In Moby-Dick, speaking to future environmentally minded generations, Ahab is killed with his own rope, which is this idea we talked about before, as he tries to kill the white whale who never pursued him, and in the process spurs the death of his entire crew, save by chance this one witness, who's Ishmael. The whale survives and the ocean rolls on. People, scholars, the fish and ish survive, as some people like to say. 21st centuries may read this conclusion as a comfort, a green or blue fable, but also as a far darker death knell for humans on this watery planet and what we will bring down with us, which is the ideas that you all have brought out. So that is the last section of this chapter called Ocean in this new companion to Herman Melville that I really recommend. It just has all these really nice bite-sized chapters that refer to anything you might want to know about Melville, and good for high school and college students. Any thoughts that come to your mind as I'm reading that you want to share or bridge or add to this list? Yeah, Gina.
I was thinking where you said, we can't think that he was thinking about climate refugees, but surely they had climate refugees then as well from things like Krakatoa and, major earthquakes that were happening and, fires and floods, so they would have recognized that idea that you can be a climate refugee, I guess, I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, because, and it's not like people, I've been fortunate to be able to sail to Kiribati and meet with students there, and we had some students in a class with us online, the miracle of Zoom this summer. We were able to bring students from Kiribati with some of our students, and they're all fully aware that their situation is a result of something that is not their fault, and that is happening from somewhere else that they have to deal with first, that they're the kind of this front lines of climate change. But it's a really good point, because we know that Melville, Thoreau, who'd never been there, but Melville had other writers at that time were referring to the impacts of Western colonialism on these Pacific Island nations, more from a cultural perspective, but also from an environmental perspective. And so this idea that the displacement or the sort of infringement of the damage that Western culture was doing to these cultures, Melville also was grappling with. So that's a really good point. Yeah, just he saw it firsthand, and yeah, good point. Yeah.
There was some marine damage already by Elvis time, because Stellacina, for instance, was already extinct.
Yeah. And what's your name? We haven't gotten we got all to introduce ourselves. Keith. Thanks, Keith. Yeah.
What was the question or comment?
He was pointing out that there was environmental damage at the time. He pointed out the stellar sea cow, which is mid-1700s, and definitely we knew that was extinct by the early 1800s. And that's a really, we can jump ahead a little bit. On your sheet here, I think I put a couple examples of chapters that I think are particularly good for eco-critical readings, and one of them is, Does the Whale Diminish, Will He Perish? And that's where Melville comes out and says, okay, are whales smaller than they used to be, just physically in terms of their size? And then, is hunting kind of affecting their marine populations? And we can get into that a little bit. But generally, for Melville, the debate is happening in the 1840s and 50s. He's aware of the debate, but he arrives in the end that, and we're really only kind of talking about two species of whales. Well, he's talking about sperm whales, and he's talking about right whales. And when he talks about right whales, he's referring to all different three species of right whales and the bowhead whales. But that gets a little complicated. But a small portion of all the whale species that are out there. But he believes in the end that the whales are going to be okay because of the inefficiency of 19th century whaling. And there's actually, historically, he's not entirely off, and we can get into some of that. But it's a really good point that Keith brings up, because Melville, Thoreau, the people that we have these records from are recognizing extinction on land, the buffalo, wolves, deforestation in New England, all the way out into the Mississippi River realm. But these sort of extinctions of like the stellar sea cow, the Caribbean monk seal, some other, the great auk, which is coming in that's Audubon recognizes the great auk is extinct even in the 1830s and 1840s before Melville writes Moby-Dick. So there's some of these that are out there, but in the end, at least the way Melville depicts it, in the 1850s, if we take him as a representative of the larger public, the deep ocean is still beyond the hand of man. That humans really can't affect the deep ocean environment. Coastal zones, land zones, but part of the reason why we might think that Ishmael is going out there in the first place is because he still believes that the ocean is this deep, wild space. I don't know if you want to add anything more. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's really, because it's a really interesting element of like, you know, where does Melville stand and what were people aware of? What was in the public consciousness at this time? And that's so interesting. Yeah, and I hear you. Yeah, like my eye doctor is like, that's kind of where you are right now. Like, you can't like fix it. I was like, you know, I think that one thing that Melville talks a lot about, and Brit is the chapter that I just adore and that I return to all the time. Let's just read one paragraph from Brit, and that's chapter 58 for those of you that have a copy of the book. And I think we have a couple copies kicking around. No, those are, don't worry, Gina, it's okay. It's just a short, yeah. And I'll read it out loud unless somebody is feeling, anybody feeling, the oratorial? Yes, excellent. Yes, okay. Oh, love it. Okay. So just read that paragraph, but though. And so we're starting, it's like the fifth paragraph in, but though to landsmen in general.
But though to landsmen. Oh, this is my live stream to read. Thank you. Okay. Oh, I've got a mic.
Yes.
Cheers, thank you. Okay. But though to landsmen in general, the native inhabitants of the seas have ever been regarded with emotions unspeakably unsocial and repelling, though we know the sea to be an everlasting terra incognita, so that Columbus sailed over numberless unknown worlds to discover his once superficial western one, though by vast odds the most terrific of all mortal disasters have immemorially and indiscriminately befallen tens of hundreds of thousands of those who have gone upon the waters, though but a moment's consideration will teach that however baby man may brag of his science and skill, and however much in a flattering future that science and skill may augment, yet forever and ever, to the crack of doom, the sea will insult and murder him, and pulverize the stateliest, stiffest frigate he can make. Nevertheless, by the continual repetition of these very impressions, man has lost the sense of full awfulness of the sea, which originally belongs to it. Is that it?
That's great. Thank you. And so yay! Thank you for reading that. That's almost a single sentence. So English teachers, if you're looking to, teach about run-ons, you could use this as an example. I love that paragraph because I think it's one of the most, here is how I feel about the ocean. And what happens in this scene is Melville's up on the masthead, or Melville/Ishmael is up on the masthead. He's observing a whole bunch of right whales in the water, and the right whales are just gently feeding on zooplankton at the surface, and he's up there, up at the masthead looking at them, and they look like so quiet. Like at first they even look like rocks, and then it's like elephants, and oh, it's just so peaceful. And then it's almost like he's like, oh, the sea is just like a peaceful land. And then it's like he stops the record. It's like, no, actually not at all. The ocean and land are totally different. There's no analogies to the animals. It's more fierce. It's more terrible at sea. It's more wild. The ocean is still taking our biggest frigates, our biggest ships. It's still killing us. It still has the power to kill us. It doesn't care about any of us. It kills its own. And however much baby man may brag of his science and skill, it's still going to sort of reap its horrors on us. And it's just such a powerful of like, oh yeah, okay, this is like, people were afraid of the sea. And it's not that we're not afraid of the sea, we're just kind of afraid of the sea for different reasons now. We're afraid of the sea because of big hurricane events, big tsunami events, and we're also, in the slow motion fear of the sea, of sea level rise. But this sort of like sea as the agent of God, we're kind of moved into a different phase with a lot of people's perceptions about that. And Melville also represents these very basic things that we just see playing out right here, that we could interview anybody here and say, well, why'd you come here? To immerse yourself in the water, to look out at the sea, to look at the ships, to feel that blue space. Melville refers to all of these things, particularly in that first chapter of like, people are just drawn to water, to meditate at the water. But the one thing that Melville really never shows in Moby-Dick is this concept that the sea needs our help, that it's our job to be stewards of the ocean. And so wear and tear on land, yes, but on the deep ocean, it's not in kind of Ishmael's radar. Again, he would kind of think of that as like, in Ahab's heresy, the idea that he could have some kind of control over the ocean or the creatures that live there was sort of profane towards a Christian God. So Britt is a really nice one about that. And does the whale diminish is another one, although with whales, he's a little bit more spread out. And we're sort of getting to the end of our time. And so I guess I would, in these sort of three topics in the further chapters, right, for eco-critical readings, which are you more interested in hearing about? So we could read a selection from the Candles, which kind of talks a little bit about storms and science versus faith. We talk a little bit about, get a little bit more into this idea of extinction and whale populations and how Melville understood them. Or we could talk about the sort of how people in the 19th century would have thought about killing whales, like actual that sort of going out there and hitting them with a harpoon. Does anybody have a particular interest or something that they'd like to discuss?
The last one.
The cruelty of whales? Okay, well, let's do a little, how about let's do cruelty of whales, and then we'll pause. I'll explain kind of what the next activity is, which is totally optional, and then let's talk about does the whale diminish. Okay, so in this, the Pequod Meets the Virgin, chapter 81, and this is, if we're doing a writing exercise, I really love this one as something to draw, because there's something very visual happening that Melville does, which is really pretty sneaky and totally ahead of his time. Because one of the things that Melville does, I think, so well is that he represents all these different views of whales at the time. Whales as deities, whales as enemies, whales as representative of money, whales as something that we should care for, or at least consider as sentient and smart. So I'm on a paragraph that's about midway through, which it was a terrific, most pitiable, and maddening sight. And so what is happening in this scene is that the whalemen are chasing after whales, and they get a whale that is really old and really sick. It's got a sore on it, it's got a lame fin, and it's just the sick one of the pod. And one of the mates is harpooning this whale, and even some of the crew are kind of like, ooh, this is like, you're kind of over the edge here. This is just like a little mean. So Melville writes this, it was a terrific, most pitiable and maddening sight. The whale was now going head out and sending his spout before him in a continual tormented jet, while his one poor fin beat his side in an agony of fright. Now to this hand, now to that, He yawed in his faltering flight, and still at every billow that he broke, he spasmodically sank in the sea or sideways rolled towards the sky, his one beating fin. So have I seen a bird with clipped wing making affrighted broken circles in the air, vainly striving to escape the piratical hawks, those same frigate birds. But the bird has a voice, and with plaintive cries will make known her fear. But the fear of this vast dumb brute of the sea was chained up and enchanted in him. He had no voice, save that choking respiration through his spout hole, and this made the sight of him unspeakably pitiable. So this is 1850s. We've got Royal Society of Protection of Animals happening 1820s, 1830s, but it's mostly focused on horses and pets, not on fish or wild animals in the deep ocean. We're decades and decades until that. But here's Melville showing this moment that we need to give voice to the dumb brute, this whale that cannot speak. But then he kind of pulls back. Then he says, while still, in his amazing bulk, portcullis jaw, and omnipotent tail, there was enough to appall the stoutest man who so pitied. So he was went all the way. He was like, oh, this poor whale. But it was still kind of a monster. It was really gross and had big teeth and stuff. So he doesn't go all the way, but he represents this moment. And what is really intriguing about this chapter, so then they harpoon this poor old whale, and then a couple pages later, the paragraph that begins, as the three boats lay there on that gently rolling sea. This is where, if you have students, I would recommend asking them to draw and try to envision what is actually happening in this moment. So as the three boats lay there on that gently rolling sea, gazing down into its eternal blue noon, and as not a single groan or cry of any sort, nay, not so much as a ripple or a bubble came up from its depths, what landsman would have thought, what beneath all that silence and placidity, the utmost monster of the seas was writhing and wrenching in agony. Not 8 inches or perpendicular rope were visible at the bows. And he goes on to kind of talk about how extraordinary it is that it's suspended. The sword of him that layeth at him cannot hold the spear, the dart, nor the habergeon. He esteemed iron as straw, the arrow cannot make him flee. Darts are counted as stubble, he laugheth at the shaking of a spear. This the creature, this he, oh, that unfulfillments should follow the prophets. For with the strength of 1,000 thighs in his tail, Leviathan had run his head under the mountains of the sea to hide him from the Pequod's fish spears. And then, in that sloping afternoon sunlight, the shadows that the three boats sent down beneath the surface must have been long enough and broad enough to shade half Xerxes' army. Who can tell how appalling to the wounded whale must have been such huge phantoms flitting over his head? So all of a sudden, we're actually under the water and we're looking up from the whale's perspective and we're calling the humans the phantoms. So in this one tiny little moment, all of a sudden, Melville gives you the point of view from the whale looking up at the humans who are the ones that are the phantoms and the aggressors. It doesn't seem like much, but for 1850, there aren't too many fictional works that consider themselves of high metaphorical value that are trying to assume the perspective of a marine animal. In this scene then, after they kill this whale, bring him up to the surface, all sorts of gore, it's really bloody scene, it's painful, this animal clearly suffers. Then they find that this is a really old whale. This is the scene where they find an Inuit harpoon in the whale that suggests that this whale could be over 150, 200 years old, which actually proves out to be true, that this has happened, that we found bowhead whales with Inuit stone harpoons in them. So this came out, we've seen this, we have evidence of this later. And then, just to pour salt into the wound, this super old whale that had lived this long life, they lose the whale. It sinks. And so after this killing of this venerable old whale with so much wear and tear, they don't even get anything out of it. There's no economic value. They lose the whole thing. And so it's a really interesting scene to think about. And then, what is the next chapter? The honor and glory of whaling. So Melville is constantly doing these pairs of chapters where I'll have this sort of one moment that is totally in one view, and then, actually let me talk about this other thing, which is totally opposite, and how great these whalemen were, and how extraordinary this exercise was. And so Melville is constantly going back and forth with these different points of view. So I love that chapter, and there's just so much in it. The Pequod meets the Virgin. Any thoughts on that reading or that chapter? Okay, so what my idea was at the end was, and I'm representing entirely my views personally, I go to a lot of these things and I'm always like, ugh, like climate change is so bad, and I'm such a bad person, and our electric car can't go this far, so I drove my Volvo with its, 20 miles per gallon up here. And so I always like to give an opportunity to do something and try to do something. You're welcome to take these postcards home and send them out to whoever you like. There are some addresses at the end if you just want to write to your California representatives, or you just want to send a postcard to a friend and say, hey, I've been thinking about climate change. What do you think we can do? I have stamps. I'd be happy to give you a stamp for your postcard. Maybe you want to do it right now, and I'll mail it for you. And here's even a possible text for your postcard if this was something you wanted to do. So totally open. You're welcome to grab 5 of these postcards. You're welcome to grab a few stamps. You're welcome to stay here and write a postcard if you want to whoever, to one of these representatives. And these are some organizations that I just personally like, not any official endorsement from anybody. And then so I know people have stuff to do. It's 2:15, but I'd also be happy to just continue to talk about, does the whale diminish, will he perish, or anything else. And before I go, I'm sort of duty bound also to push another book. This is a new collection. It's an anthology by a scholar named Christoph Irmscher and myself, and we basically edited John James Audubon's. Audubon did these amazing paintings, as you know, but he actually had a lot of writing. And he would describe the Florida Keys in the 1820s, the Bay of Fundy in the 1840s. And so he has it's a really interesting environmental history text, but it's also, Audubon, if you've been following the news, is also a pretty problematic figure. He was a slaveholder. Some of the things that he wrote about the indigenous people are, at best, kind of like, heroic savage, and at worst, just really awful and racist. And so we kind of try to sort of, what do we do with that? With like useful marine environmental history, with a character that is sort of seeing the world through a way that we don't value today. And so you're welcome to check this book out if you like on your way out. So that's sort of like formal conclusion, but I would love to stay and talk about anything with anybody. But I thank you so much for being here.